we are going to be talking about trauma in the teen today, and I have some amazing presenters here. Before I introduce them, I just want to give a little bit of the kind of ground rules of what we're going to be doing. So I have a couple of my colleagues in the chat box who will be kind of sharing some information, engaging with you in the chat, and helping us to run our session. If you do have questions that we can get to either during the presentation or at the end of the presentation, please share them in the Q&A function. You can find that at the bottom menu. And if you want to share your question, please do so. If you do have a similar question to one that's already been shared, please go ahead and use the upvote function, which will allow you to kind of thumbs up the question that you do want to get answered. I will have questions for the presenters that I have prepared, but I do want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to ask questions, and we'll kind of try to address those during the presentation and at the end of the presentation. There is a ton of material to cover today, but I'm really happy that we have these amazing presenters here. So before I kind of dig in, I do want to give a congratulations. The Excellence in College Counseling webinar series also has the opportunity to present an award to a counselor or a group of counselors that we know have been doing really great work. And so we are really excited that we were able to present that award to the entire counseling staff at Miami Palmetto Senior High School. So just want to give them a shout out. If anybody's from that high school, please go ahead and share that in the chat box too. And like I said, there will be some folks in the chat box kind of attending to that and asking you some questions. So let's go ahead and introduce our amazing presenters. So we have a few folks that are just going to be brilliant people. First is Erin Ray, who is currently the Assistant Director of Student Outreach at the Skidmore College Opportunity Program, and soon to be the Director of the Opportunity Program at Hamilton College on Monday. So we're very excited for him. We also have Briana Avery, who is the Director of College at Dream Charter High School in Harlem, New York, and Dr. Sheila Raja, who is a clinical psychologist and associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Now, I do want you to see our presenters' faces. We won't be having slides here. They're really just, to kind of introduce our presenters, but I am going to kind of stop sharing. The other thing I do want to note is that we will be recording this session, and we will be following up with you to send that recording. So if you miss something or if you have to jump out for a meeting, don't worry, we are going to send you the recording as well as some resources that we wanted to be able to share with you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen here, and we will get started. So, this has been an incredibly difficult past year for everyone. And I think one of the most important things that I want to do here is give everyone here a platform to be able to share kind of what's going on with them. So my first question that I want to direct to you all is, this is such an important topic. It's something that's really important to me. I've done some work in this area, and I've learned from all of the folks on this call going through this past year, but also kind of considering the issue of trauma and dealing with teenagers during this time in their transition to college. It's such an integral time in their lives. This has been such a year that is unlike anyone that we have ever seen. And so my question to you that we'll kind of get started with, and I'll pass it to Sheila and then move on to Briana and Erin, is what is important for everyone here to know about what you're seeing in each of your roles, all those being very different, right? What is something that you want everyone to know and to hear about what you're seeing with the teenagers you are working with?
So I'll go ahead and start with that question. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and talk about this really important topic, I think. I'm coming at this from a couple of different perspectives. One, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm the author of a couple of books on PTSD and trauma associated with teens, one of which I actually co-authored with my 17-year-old daughter, who is applying to colleges right now. So I kind of wearing different hats on this. But, as someone who specializes in PTSD and trauma and is interested in working with teens, I think the important thing, as you said, right, is we've never seen a prolonged stressor like this in our generation. And we're adding on to it, all the racial injustice that has been brought to light. We have a lot of political unrest going on. And so school curricula is going on as usual. I have two teenagers in my house that are sort of going on as usual. And I think we really have to appreciate that kids are under a tremendous amount of stress right now, even under the best of circumstances. And we're going to talk about what are some of the more vulnerable circumstances. I'm sure we're going to get to all of that. But even under the best of circumstances, they're looking at blank Zoom screens sometimes. They're in the classroom, but they're worried about maybe catching COVID, or maybe they've had family members, affected. It's hard to stay motivated in these kind of situations. Hybrid learning can be disruptive and difficult. So it can be anxiety provoking. And so the American Psychological Association actually put out data a couple of years ago on Generation Z, which is sort of this generation that we're seeing, and they were already higher in anxiety and depression. And that's what worries me. And then we sort of put all of this stuff on top. And so I think we just really have to be aware of that our kids are going through a lot right now.
That's such an important point, and I think, one of the people that I know will kind of understand that is Briana, so I'm gonna kinda turn it over to her to share her piece about this.
Yeah, I definitely second everything that Sheila said, and thinking about the ways in which our students are dealing with something that none of us have ever dealt with before. There is no roadmap there. There is no like resource guide when this started in March for us to know how to counsel students from home. And so I am director of college at Dream Charter High School, and I, am school based. I'm actively in school. Like my mask is right next to me in case somebody comes into this room, and so I think that speaks to like the heightened anxiety our students have when they're in school, but also something that's really important for folks to remember is that kids miss school. Kids need school. For many of us, myself included, like school was my lifeline. I was in school from 7:20 a.m. I'm from Flint, Michigan, so I was at Flint Northern at 7:20 every single day. Went to Flint Central right after my home school to take the rest of my classes. Did theater, tennis. I was in school till maybe 7 o'clock for 12 hours. And that was where I socialized. That's where I found support. That was where I was challenged, and that's where I was seen. And so for our young people who are in some states and cases hybrid, even at hybrid schools, some students are fully remote, and in other districts and states where they're fully remote, our kids are not getting the type and depth of support and just socialization that they're used to. And that is just like, to put it very simply, is like making your students really sad. Like they're not having the years that they've envisioned, that they've seen on TV, that they've like dreamed about. And the impact of that like just has to be acknowledged. And so the other things I'll say is, what our students really need is for us to hold space for them to share. Because on top of being at home, there are all of these other horrible things happening that make them feel devalued, and make them feel like they don't matter. And so they need us to hold space, and they need spaces to share, and they need as many opportunities as possible to be around those loving, caring adults that they're used to being with. And so, the current situation between the pandemic and a lot of like racial injustice and white supremacy and things that are happening makes all of those things not as easy. But those are the spaces that we are still actively and intentionally trying to create here at Dream for our young people, because we just know that they need them.
Thank you so much for that, and, speaking of students not having something that they envisioned, I would imagine that that has displayed itself so much in college. So, Erin, I'd like to turn it over to you to kind of share your experience that you've had over the last year.
Yeah, absolutely. As Nor mentioned, I work in the opportunity program at Skidmore, and we work primarily with students who are mostly first gen, coming from a lower socioeconomic background. So outside of a pandemic, college can be a challenge. Then you throw in, especially for our first year students, that they went through their most of their college search process, or at least like figuring out which campus they want to attend online. They did not get to visit campus. They did not get to sit in the dining hall and see what the vibes are like. They did not get to sit in on classes in person and see what the faculty student dynamic is. So they had to make a decision based on what other people are telling them, and what that financial aid package is like. And then there's a lot of uncertainty about even if college is going to happen in the fall. Is it going to be in person? Is it going to be remote? The pandemic numbers were kind of like dwindling a little bit during the summer. I think people became really comfortable, but then it got real when students arrived to campus, and maybe the experience was nothing like they expected because no one really knew what to expect. They knew they'd have to wear masks, but did they know that they couldn't have other students in their room to hang out? Okay, I can't hang out in my room. Let me go hang out in the campus center. Well, you can't have more than 10 people in any space at any given time. All right, that's fine. It's nice out. We'll go hang out on the green and throw the frisbee around. We can do that. But in upstate New York, things get a little cold a little sooner. All of a sudden, it's getting darker earlier, and classes are still happening. COVID cases are rising. Halloween happens. The national political scene happened, and it was sort of the perfect storm for students to fall through the cracks. And why, especially with first year students, did they fall through the cracks? Because they didn't physically know anybody on campus. They did not have necessarily a community outside of Zoom. If it was a faculty member who their classes were only remote, you only know them through Zoom. If they were a staff member who maybe was on campus one day a week, you're probably not going to get to know them very well. So students coming in who never experienced college as it was before, weren't able to access the same kind of supports that would normally be there. And institutions of higher education are trying to figure out what's going on, but so much is happening in a short period of time. I think a lot of institutions failed to really provide community for students who desperately needed it. For students who had been in college and experienced higher ed before a global pandemic, now come back to a very different world. It really, I could see it in our upper class students. They couldn't access the same kind of supports that they were used to. It looked very different, and that ended up combined with the fact that people back home, people in their communities, are being impacted by COVID. They're still expected to do work. I think in the spring semester, faculty did a really good job of being flexible and working with students. And now this past semester has kind of been like, yeah, but you should be used to this now. Like, no, you should not be used to this. So students are trying to keep up with their work. The country's burning. Their classmates somehow are seem like everything is okay and they're turning in work. And so when they're falling behind or they're not turning in work, it only heightens their feeling of imposter syndrome. And so we have students right now who they did fine this semester, but they're not coming back because they just can't continue with the way this COVID-19 college experience has been.
Mhm. I mean, it's so important to hear that, and so important for folks to understand, especially for first year students. There are so many students who going into college don't know where they're supposed to go for certain things. Add that to the fact that you can't see anybody in person. You couldn't have necessarily attended orientation the same way. It's just such a difficult kind of perfect storm of things that are affecting these students. And so kind of building on that, I know Aaron, when we talked about this before, you were talking about how, yes, if you're experiencing a traumatic event and you want to be able to go to a counseling office or someone who is on campus, they're going to be on Zoom. If you want to talk to your resident advisor on Zoom. So it's really difficult for those folks to make connections. And I want to build upon something that Brianna said as well, and I'm going to turn it over to Brianna too. Um, you mentioned this concept of school being shelter, right? For a lot of students, school is shelter. Schools where they get their meals, schools where they have the support that they need. With with this current situation, how have you kind of seen students trying to um, address traumas and trying to get support. How has that shifted for you? What have you had to do in response to that for students who have to be at home or who have to be in spaces where they have to try to put everything together to just attend school? What have you been seeing and how have you all had to respond to that?
Yes, so on the higher ed side, like the counseling center is normally the go-to when students are having challenges. You point them to that as a resource, but that is not the same during a pandemic. And so, yes, a lot of those resources have moved to Zoom, and there's been some good out of that, and there's been some not so great things. So the good is there were changes made at least the state level, so students were able to access resources back in their home communities via Zoom. So when it comes to students trying to have a counselor who looks like them or looks similar to them or is culturally competent, students had access to that for maybe the first time during their college experience. That and that would work with their health insurance. I think one of the challenges of being in Saratoga Springs, there's not a lot of diversity in terms of therapy, both in and outside of Skidmore's counseling center. And so this provided an outlet. Students were able to continue working with folks who they were familiar with working from maybe in high school or during the summer months. But again, the challenge is it's on Zoom. And so in order to lead a student to that counseling center, you have to have a Zoom appointment with them and maybe have them try to call the counseling center while they're on Zoom with you. You can't walk them to the counseling center anymore. For students who are reluctant to utilize those types of resources, and we do have students where you just don't talk about mental health. The challenge is even greater because again, you're not in the room. You can't necessarily share how important it is. Like you can say it over Zoom, but in person, they can like feel how important it is. And that's just not there anymore. So yes, I can say, hey, I put it into the chat. Here's these resources. I have no way of knowing for sure. Did they click on those resources? Did they go to the website? Did they make that phone call? And so I have a shared student with Miss Avery, and we try to hit it from all angles, and it still took that student over 2 months to make the appointment, which outside of the pandemic it wouldn't have taken that long, because there's also an anxiety like, how do I do it on Zoom? What is it like? Do I have a quiet space? This is what a lot of people don't think about. Do I have a quiet space where I can do my classes, let alone a private therapy session? And so for students who are in doubles during the academic year, when the library doesn't have enough space for students to have a quiet space, like, okay, they may want to access those resources, but they don't have a space on campus or at home where they can do it.
Exactly, and that's kind of a good transition for me to turn it to Brianna because in high school, you there are many colleges who were able to house students, but everyone's at home in high school, in most situations. So, how have you had to respond to this, right? In high school, students, like I said, are going for shelter, they're going for meals, they're going for support from their teachers and from their counselor. For them not to be able to access that in the same way must have taken a huge adjustment for you on your end. So I'd love to hear from you how you have been able to respond to students in this way too.
So, what I will say is that at Dream, our admin team has been able to, has intentionally spent time trying to be incredibly innovative with the ways in which, we support our students. So myself and our other two assistant principals and our principal have spent a lot of time thinking about like the ways in which we replicate as best as possible, like school settings for our young people, and thinking about like making sure they're going home with meals for the weekend or for the days that they're not in school, in having virtual clubs and after school opportunities for students to check into. But I think something that Aaron touched on that's really important is it takes teams of people, and in schools teams of people are not always readily available. We are all stretched so thin as educators on a good day that when we're having a less than good 10 months, it's really hard to consistently, provide that support, but it does take teams of people. So when we're thinking about like our young people who are in need or who are in crisis, at Dream, they have a college counselor if they're an 11th or 12th grader. They also have a youth development specialist if they're 9th or 10th. So they have someone responsible for their case management. We have mental health counselors as well. We have advisors for each student. And then we also have an admin team who will pull children into calls and say, what is going on with your college list? Why have you not submitted that application? Why are all of your schools reaches? And we've had conversations about what your list actually needs to look like. And so having a team of people who are willing to hop on those calls, whether college their is in their job description or not, has been really helpful in me being able to support my team of counselors through the work that they do. But I mean, the issues of space that Aaron talks about are so relevant in New York City. New York City is the home of the intergenerational household. Most of our students are living in very small spaces with their siblings, their parents, sometimes extended family members, sometimes grandparents as well. And so, where are our students doing work? Where are they finding focused time to do work? How are they even able to hold themselves accountable when the second they're off Zoom, they have home responsibilities in a different way than they did before the pandemic, assuming that they don't have home responsibilities during Zoom, and they often do. And so, how do we help our young people carve out that space? That's what's been most difficult. And that has also driven our belief that school needs to be open, and it is scary. Like I am anxious every time I walk into school, to be honest. But we also know that our children need those spaces to do work, because at no fault of their own or their families, they just don't have it. And so making sure to physically provide that space is something that has been really important to us. And in the moments where we couldn't provide that in-person space, providing as best as we can a virtual space, office hours, like bingo nights. You would be like the things kids will do on a family feud game just to be able to engage and laugh with their friends. But definitely thinking about like the constraints that space and even the stress and burnout of our staff have just kind of posed this year.
Definitely. Those are such amazing points and great ideas as well. So thank you for sharing that. I want to maybe see if you can share with us some notes about kind of the events that you've been hosting to engage with students so that we could potentially share those resources out with the counselors. Dr. Raja, I'm going to turn it to you because you're kind of seeing it from two lenses, as a parent and as a psychologist. So how are you seeing the concepts that Aaron and Briana are bringing up about this concept of space, the idea of sharing your thoughts and opening up to someone who looks like you, how important that is, and maybe how that's been affected in the last year? I'd love to hear a little bit about that from you, and what you've kind of been seeing with the high school age kids that you are working with.
Right. I mean, we know that schools serve so many different functions, right? They don't just serve an educational function, of course. They're mental health and nutrition and so much more. And the pandemic has just absolutely made that apparent, as you all pointed out, as Briana and Aaron pointed out. And I think that, got me thinking about how we all know that the pandemic has really exacerbated every known inequity, right? I mean, there are, students who have, like my kids, have a quiet place to study, a desk that I ran out and bought for them, and, a violence free home, all of those things. And yet, there are kids that have caretaking responsibilities and, they've got to feed somebody while the Zoom class is going on because the mom's an essential worker. So that adds a whole nother level of stress. And, so when we're looking at their achievement this year, how much of that is that, they've got these wonderful environments, and how much of that is, what's going on? And I think we have to really think about that. And, I'm thinking about resilience, what goes into resilience with some of these young people. And, in clinical psychology, there's a term that's talked a lot about, which is mental health first aid. the idea of like, how can we get prepared, and sort of everybody, like say after a natural disaster or something, a layperson could go out, get trained in this method, and be supportive to their community. I kind of think it's time for us to get trained in resilience first aid, all of us. I mean, not just so that, because, Aaron talked about the kid that takes 2 months to follow up because therapy's scary and therapy stigmatized. And especially, if you don't have a family where people are doing therapy or a community where it's accepted. But are there skills that all of us can know about? And honestly, there are. They're real. I mean, I'm really passionate about this because it's like there are skills like, how do you keep a good routine? How do you watch the ways in which you're coping? Um, Cognitive flexibility, the idea of how do we look at something from many different angles? How do we plan for healthy chances? How do we tolerate discomfort? Not in like a horrible way, but how do we learn how to name what we're feeling and then work on it from there? How do we find meaning and purpose? Those aren't necessarily things where you need a clinician to help you with that. I mean, those are things where I think we could get our counselors trained on. Some of them are trained on these things. They've trained themselves, they've learned, they've educated, they do CEs. But I think I'd love to see our whole country get, trained on resilience skills to be able to support each other, and especially our young people. I mean, um, I think the time has come. We've got such a prolonged stressor here.
Those are really great points. And I think you brought up some really interesting pieces and that kind of highlight the importance of the role of a counselor in school, right? Um, for many of these students, and there was a question in the chat that I actually might bring up now, but for many of these students, mental health is very stigmatized, very stigmatized. They hear a lot of things about how, maybe anxiety or depression aren't real, or this is not something that we do. Deal with it. Those kinds of things are very much ingrained in many, many students. And so if they're at home and they're not in school with someone who is kind of trying to give them more information about that, then it's very difficult for them to kind of explain that to their families. And so I do want to kind of regard this question uh, from Sienna a little bit because this kind of involves everyone in this call. When a student is trying to seek help for mental health and their families might get upset, how do you broach that subject from each of your lenses? So I'll start with Sheila and then Briana and then Aaron. And then I'm going to shift over to a different topic. But I think this is such an important um, thing to learn how to do and how to explain and share with these students. So I would love to hear your perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think that you really have to educate families that mental health is just like, any other type of health issue. If you are prone to being diabetic, you're going to have to watch what you eat, right? So if you're feeling a little down or you're feeling a little worried, it's the time to get in with some good coping strategies and figure those out. And especially when we're talking about young people, this is exactly the time that they need to learn how to do that, ideally before they go away to college and are faced with that, but certainly within the first few years of college. And so I think on an individual level, we really need to learn how to talk about mental health in a way that, doesn't have stigma. I also think there's a lot that schools can do, colleges and schools can do. I mean, I know my daughter's school, the social work team just sends out these regular little health tips, how to keep yourself mentally healthy. And they just include those, and that goes out to everybody. It goes out to the parents too. And I think it sets a larger tone for mental health as a part of life, and that, it's no different than anything else. So I think setting that tone is really important.
That's a good point. And I'm going to turn it to Brianna because I think the counselor's role is not just this, it's so many things, particularly with counselors who are not just focusing on college access, but they're focusing on helping the students through school and helping them with academics, helping them with mental health. So, Brianna, from your perspective, how do you see kind of broaching that subject with students whose families maybe aren't familiar with the concept of mental health?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the many hats that our school-based folk wear consistently. And so something that one of my team members likes to remind our staff when sometimes we get sidetracked or we get like caught up in like what is or isn't happening in a classroom or in a one-to-one, is that we are our students' advocates. Our biggest job is to advocate for our students. Um, I could never have a counselor on my team who didn't believe that, because our goal is to support our young people in experiencing some of the it's adulthood in a bubble. There are things that they're going to experience. There are mistakes they're going to make that when they make that in high school, we can help them process. We can help them talk through it. We can help them have access to the resources they need so that these are mistakes that they're not repeating, right? Like this is their trial run at like being grown up, and we have to treat it as such. And so in moments when we know our young people are in need, or that we know our families might be resistant, or a student might be scared that their family is resistant to them seeking out any kind of health service, mental health or physical wellness or anything, it's our job to advocate for our students and to be there with our students, preparing them to facilitate the conversation, but having their back in it. And I think that is something that maybe doesn't happen as often because we feel like we have to lead the charge. No, our job is to train our young people to be able to have these conversations. This is their trial run. How do you talk to your parents about something they disagree with? How do you talk to your parents about things they might not believe in? How do you lay those groundworks for students to be able to advocate for themselves in a broader sense with their families and in a broader sense with their peers, or the people that they will meet on college campuses who will also have different beliefs than them and might challenge them? How do we prepare them in high school to have those conversations? And so a lot of the work that we do and that my team does is making sure that young people have the tools and the practice to have those types of conversations. Initially, it is us walking through it together. Then it's the student facilitating the conversation with you next to them, because eventually they will be on a college campus with Aaron and they are not going to have me next to them. They might be lucky enough to have an advocate at their institution, but they also might not. And so we need to be spending the time and the energy in helping our young people understand the strategies to be able to facilitate those difficult conversations. One around mental health is one, but there are numerous that are going to consistently come and consistently confront them that they're going to have to deal with.
Just such amazing points there, and so many things I want to expand on. I wish I had 5 hours for this session, and I just, want to make sure to get to all of it, but we will be ending in a little bit, in about a half hour. I want to turn it over to Erin because there are so many things that you said, Briana and Sheila, that kind of display themselves when the student gets to college. For many, many students, college is the first place they are going to see a mental health counselor. And, I have students asking me who may have not previously felt comfortable. Do they have counselors on college campuses? What other resources can I take advantage of? The transition to college, not only in this time, but in other times, um, is just such a turning point for these students. So I'd love to hear from you, Erin, kind of regarding the points that Briana and Sheila brought up. How do you kind of empower the student to advocate for themselves in that way, to teach them about mental health and to teach them, here are the things that you are able to take advantage of? And what do you wish maybe other folks knew, or counselors knew, or parents knew about how students can find these things on college campuses and how they can advocate for themselves there?
Yeah, absolutely. So something we try to do is just normalize mental health. Talk about it. We're fortunate enough that we bring in our students for 5 weeks during the summer for a summer program. And so our counseling center is introduced to our students multiple times during the summer. Even before that, all of our admitted student program we're talking about it. In my info sessions for school groups, there's a portion that talks about mental health. Even though you may not be coming to Skidmore, but whatever college you go to, it's important to know where those resources are and how to access those resources. Higher ed moves slow. I think everyone on this webinar will agree that higher ed's probably one of the slower moving industries, and there's been such a quick uptick in the amount of students that need and are seeking out the resources that colleges have struggled to keep up with the demand. And funding counseling center, like the money has to come from somewhere, and there's some institutions that have the financial resources. There's a lot of institutions, especially during this pandemic, that don't have it, and so they've had to be creative. And there are colleges that have partnered with other organizations to help handle cases that are happening after hours, because counseling centers are open from like 9 to 4. You don't just have your mental health challenges between 9 and 4. A lot of times they're going to happen outside of those times. And so colleges have been utilizing these outside organizations to help with that. But there are a lot of colleges where there maybe are just four counselors, maybe a social worker, and then oftentimes there's a lack of diversity. And so specifically for students of color on campus, they might try out the counseling center. And I talked about how being remote has allowed them to connect with folks that they're more comfortable with, but they will seek it out. And if you don't have a counseling center that is culturally competent, like they could be really talented at what they do, but if you are not culturally competent, it is not going to matter for those students. At the same time, kind of what Bree was saying, like we do have to work with our students and to help them lean into discomfort sometimes, and help them to realize, especially if they're going to attend a PWI, like you're going to not always have access to folks who are going to look like you or be from a similar background as you. And what does that mean? And what are the things that you are willing to sacrifice in order to receive the support that you need? And what are some of the non-negotiables? And just getting students thinking about that earlier. I try not to wait until my students are having a mental health crisis to start talking about mental health. I rather a student go to the counseling center before they're having a crisis, so that there's a foundation. They felt it out. They've tried it out before, so that when they do have that crisis, it's not a completely new experience for them. But it really is up to colleges to continue to put an emphasis and financial resources into building up not only the counseling center, but providing the trainings for faculty and staff around campus. Title IX trainings are required. Sexual harassment trainings are required. Mental health first aid should be required. That should be part of the onboarding process. And you may never use those techniques in whatever your role may be, but if you have a campus community that is at least competent in mental health first aid, I think it could help to alleviate the challenge of just even getting students in the door to a counseling center or seeking out those services.
And I think kind of building on that, what you had mentioned in the beginning, part of your role in the college is to normalize these things, normalize mental health, and normalize the resources that students could take advantage of. And one topic that I've really thought in depth about, and I discussed with you too, is kind of how these traumas that students are going through might display themselves even on the college application, right? So there are students who might reveal something that has happened to them, and might kind of work with either their counselor or put something on an application that a college is reading that might indicate some kind of trauma. From your perspectives, both Briana and Aaron, I'll start with Briana and then I'll go to Aaron. Um, how are you seeing this display itself? What kind of concerns do you have when it comes to students putting these things on paper, sometimes for the first time? And how do you work with students who have dealt with a very traumatic event, including, the things that may have happened in the last year, when it comes to both their college applications, but also the college process in general, the application process?
Yeah, when so historically there have been issues of like trauma porn in college essays. There that meaning like a belief that a student has to disclose something incredibly traumatic in order to earn their space in an incoming class. And so dealing with trauma porn is something that I have been combating since year 10, and Aaron has been reading for, I think, year 10 as well. And so thinking about, in the historical context of the fact that like this is an issue that we're already dealing with, COVID has definitely exacerbated that. On applications, there is a COVID specific question that leads a lot of my students to believe that like that they need to write that they have gone through something like extraordinarily hard during COVID, but living through COVID is hard enough. Like living their lives is hard enough. And so it is very difficult in a school to explain to young people that like you don't have to sell your trauma in order to find your best fit school or to find that next opportunity. That being said, there are many circumstances where either putting that on paper is cathartic for a young person. It is, them expressing something or talking about something in a way that they never have. In editing, it is them processing something through a lens with the help of their counselor that they've never been able to process that way. It can be a way for them to see the strength in their journey. Um, and so there are times where, I think young people disclosing trauma is fine in an essay, but I do think, and Aaron, I think can speak to this more, that like there are certain things that like, historically we have worried about um, impacting the way in which a college may view a student, and a college, viewing a student as a liability instead of seeing the students like strength and resilience through their story. And so the way in which have advised students, and the way in which my team advises students is, to write about something that is important to them, that is fundamental to who they are. And if it is something that, is an indicator of trauma that they've been through, then we will work with them through that, but it doesn't have to be. And so making sure that our students know that they don't have to share their trauma like on an application. But also in the same way, like preparing your students for the trauma that is going to be inflicted on them in college. And so that I think is the other time that we're talking about trauma in the application process, in thinking about what Aaron called predominantly white colleges and what I call historically white colleges, right? Like what happens when a student goes to a historically white college and they are either the victim of a macro aggression of like blatant racism or homophobia or, a big ism, or microaggressions, which are more common, something that they may receive from their peers, from professors, from school staff, and how our young people process that trauma, which in some ways, because it is not as explicit, can mess with you more. And so having conversations with students about trauma as they're entering the college application process and as they're kind of exiting the high school are the two formal times we have that conversation. Though of course it naturally does come up more.
And Aaron, how are you seeing all of that displayed when it comes to actually reading the applications? And I think kind of sharing a bit about your role will be helpful here because I think, the opportunity program is a place where some students might be getting a little bit extra support that they might need. So I'm curious how that kind of shows itself when you are reading those applications on your end. And if you could share a bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who aren't familiar with opportunity programs, I love my job. I'm really privileged to have a role where I not only get to like recruit students and meet with them while they're in high school and read their applications, but I run a summer program that they go through. We get to know them really well, and then we act as advisors throughout their 4 years, and we really do holistic wraparound services. So when it comes to students sharing trauma in their applications, it sort of works to our advantage because we're informed if they choose to enroll, like we're informed on some of the challenges that they've faced, and so we're not caught off guard when that trauma flares up or that there's this situation at home. So sometimes when students share, it can add some value into how we support students, and we might know off the bat, like, yeah, this is probably a student that's going to need to utilize the counseling services, or this is a student who maybe isn't going to be able to go home during the breaks and during the summer, so we need to make sure we budget appropriately to support students during those times. um, it also helps us decide who's going to advise who. We have my colleague is assistant director for student support and advocacy, and so she is her purpose in our office. She has many purposes, but one of her main purposes is to act as a resource for students who maybe are coming back from leaves of absences, or who have struggled academically, or are really experiencing some challenges. So she works closely both with the counseling center as a liaison, but also is a liaison with our committee on academic standing, and with I forget the acronym. Skidmore has a lot of acronyms, but it's basically the group that talks about the students who made some boo-boos. So she's there to continue to advocate for students, provide resources to our office, and keep us in tune with what's happening on the national scene. So it does help, but for schools that don't have opportunity programs, or for students who aren't admitted into an opportunity program, for some, that trauma probably, is red, and maybe that's the reason why they were admitted. But what's happening on the back end to support that student? Many instances, nothing. That application is never looked at again. And so you have students who are being admitted into institutions, let's say, like, because of test optional or for whatever reason that you want. And these institutions historically have not admitted students with these kind of traumas, with these kinds of challenges. If they're not prepared to support these students are very likely to struggle and possibly not make it through. Students are admitted into the institution because academically they're capable, and college is hard, but it's not the academics that typically trip up students. It's all the other stuff, I have other words for it, but other stuff that's happening back home, happening on campus, happening in the world. Like, the hardest part about college is that life is still happening while you have deadlines. If life wasn't still happening and you just had deadlines, like, fine, easy peasy, like, do the work. But there's so many other things happening. And so then you throw the pandemic into it on top of all the traumas, or the trauma created through the pandemic or this last election cycle. It's going, I think the next couple of years, even after vaccines are out, we have herd immunity, and we're able to go back to normal, we're going to be seeing challenges from this pandemic in higher education, in our students in K-12 for years. And it's kind of scary.
Aaron, those are such important points, and I think it really transitions well. I know Sheila wanted to mention something on this topic, and then there was a question that we had from the audience, from Anita, who said, "Should we be thinking about this pandemic as something that will lead to PTSD? What we are dealing with now is awful, but I'm also trying to think ahead and how we move on, whenever that is that we can move to the new normal." So, Sheila, I know you wanted to say something about this, and then I would love to have you answer that question since it was directed at you. We do have about 9 minutes. So I want to make sure that question's answered, but then I kind of want to do a round robin with everyone, to kind of share a little bit, to our audience. So I'll start with you and then we'll go from there.
Well, I just, on the last question, just wanted to echo that I think it's such an important, your answers, I think, were absolutely spot on. As a clinical psychologist that works with trauma, I'm sitting there thinking, yes, absolutely. Trauma is personal and it's private. And, to share something, there's a phenomenon called secondary trauma, which is when something horrible has happened to you and then you reach out and talk to people about it for help, especially people in authority, and they either kind of blow it off or disbelieve you, that actually exacerbates PTSD symptoms. And I wonder, if you're writing about racial injustice that happened in your family on a college essay, and then you don't get into that college, you don't even get an interview, how does that feel for a student? And so I think that we need to counsel our teens and our kids really closely about what do you share and what's your own. And if it's part of your life story in terms of post-traumatic growth and you're at a different place with it, like Briana said, that's one thing. But I really do think that we on the sort of receiving end of that need to be very, very careful about not re-traumatizing people, which kind of goes into the next question, right? About um, will we all have PTSD? This is a question that we've kind of been fielding for months and months now. And I think the answer, part of that is, what are the red flags that a kid might have or that we might have even as adults? If we went in to this pandemic already with some depression and anxiety, that's something that we're going to have to, be careful of. Did we already kind of have a fear of germs or crowds or some social phobia? Social phobia is something we see a lot in young people, and we're going to see it exacerbated probably as the world opens back up. I think we are going to have to some extent a tsunami of mental health issues that probably just the counseling centers alone are not going to be able to handle. We're probably going to need to shift our focus in higher ed to a lot more education, skills-based education that's very broad and goes out to like our large college communities, because I do think we are going to see an uptick in post-traumatic stress, and we're going to see an uptick in post-traumatic stress probably in our communities that were the most vulnerable in the first place, right? So the kids that already don't have the violence-free home, the kids that don't have the quiet space, the kids that don't have the broadband, they have all these other responsibilities. So they were already the most vulnerable. And so, that's where we're really going to have to put a lot of our resources, I think.
And I think that is something that everyone in this call and all of their roles are going to be experiencing. So given our time constraint, what I want to do is first, I want to share that there will be 3 more webinars in this series. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you so that you can see the rest of those. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a round robin with everyone to kind of share your last thoughts. What is something that you want counselors to know from where you are sitting? What is something you want school counselors to know um, about this topic that maybe you feel they need to be validated on, or you feel they need to hear, or you feel, that you want to share with them? Just as we kind of exit this, we did share the link to register for the rest of these webinars as well. And as a reminder, we are going to be sending out a recording. So if you missed part of this, or if you had a colleague that wanted to join, you will be getting the recording. Everyone who registered will get a recording. We'll also be sharing resources too. So if you do have, follow-up questions, or you would like to have seen some of the resources we were talking about in the chat box, we will be sharing those tomorrow. So I'm going to go in alphabetical order. I'll start with Erin, then Brianna, and then Sheila, and then we'll be able to kind of go on our way afterwards.
I mean, there could be a lot, but I think what I'll say is that as we sort of specifically working with current seniors as we're going towards they're getting their acceptances and they're trying to figure out where to attend, it's really important to be mindful of the current impact of the pandemic and where it might be, and to not sort of tell students where they need or should attend. Guidance is great, but there are students that I've had where they were told that you have to go to Skidmore because this is the best financial aid package for you, or you have to go to Skidmore because my cousin went there and they loved it and you'll love it. Because students do trust us. They value our opinions, and sometimes they will make decisions based on that. even if it's not the right decision for them. So I have students who they're making it at Skidmore, but it wasn't their top choice. And yes, the financial aid was really great, but it maybe isn't the right place to support them outside of a pandemic, let alone inside of a pandemic.
And that's so important. Brianna, what about you?
So as somebody who has spent her career as a college counselor, and who was also like I was also my own student. Like my students reflect very much who I am and who my other Flint Community School graduates are. And so I would just, remind exactly what I said earlier, which is that like we are our students' biggest advocates for school-based counselors, for college advisors who are, maybe out of school programs or community-based. We are our students' biggest advocates. And that is a whole lot of pressure, but that is our job. And so, in having these difficult conversations, in providing support, in holding our young people accountable, as hard as that is to do in the middle of a pandemic, that is what we're here for. And so, if you haven't heard it from your manager or your principal or somebody recently, like I appreciate y'all, like I'm in there with y'all, and like we're gonna be okay. But we have to remember that like our kids really, really need us.
And Sheila, I'm going to end it with you, and then I'll kind of wrap it up.
I mean, I think there's a couple things that we can do, right? All of us as adults, and particularly college counselors, I think um, role modeling resilience skills, whether you're in the high school or the college level, just role model those, I think is really important because young people look to us for how we're coping and what we're saying about all this. The other thing is, avoidance is a rotten coping strategy. Oh my gosh, that's like one of my soapboxes is that we try to avoid difficult topics. We don't want to talk about racial injustice. We don't want to talk about political unrest, but these are on the minds of our young people. And so we have to ask them how they feel, and we have to be able to model sitting with that discomfort and how do they talk about it and how do they deal with it. And I was just thinking about this the other day. About a year ago, I had the chance to talk to a couple of giants in the field of child abuse research and adverse childhood events, and both of them have spent a lifetime in this space of teens and trauma and young people in trauma, and they both said to me, over the years, it's really important we work individually and we make a difference in individuals' lives, and we advocate for policy changes that make the lives of families better. And I think that 2021, like I love that both of Aaron and Briana used the word advocacy. We all have to embrace our inner advocate as well. Don't be shy about those things. You know what's going to make the lives of your families and your kids better, some of those bigger policy issues. And we get to talk about those too. I think that's okay. And we should.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your expertise. You all were amazing, and I really appreciate you being here, sharing your knowledge, and also appreciate everyone who joined us. Again, we'll be sending you the recording. Until then, please take care, stay safe, and thank you so much for coming. Bye, everyone.